So excited that y'all are here with us today for our webinar, Beyond the Baby Blues, an overview of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. And this is the second webinar out of the series for this month. So I'm so excited. Last week was a lot of fun. This week, today is going to be awesome. So excited to have Morgan here with us. And May is Maternal Mental Health Awareness Month. So it's time to recognize that maternal mental health disorders are the number one complication of childbirth, affecting 1 in 5 mothers. And today's presentation is hosted by Vital's Every Step project. I'll be the project manager for Every Step, and we work with the Alabama Department of Mental Health and Alabama Department of Public Health to provide ESPER implementation support to OBGYNs, ACHN, and other groups and initiatives that provide services to women across the state in an effort to identify and address substance use and mental health needs among pregnant individuals. And you can visit vitalalabama.com for resources for both professionals and individuals in the community. And you can also find out more information about our free Connect Alabama app, and that's also on the website. Um, all right, and then just a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees will be muted and your cameras will remain off throughout the session. If you have any questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A box. We'll be collecting those and addressing those throughout the presentation. So feel free to use that. I'll also be looking at the chat to see if there's anything there as well. And if you experience any technical issues during the session, please put a message in the chat box to Vital or contact ecwright@ua.edu. All right, so today I'm excited to present and introduce our presenter, Miss Morgan Bradwell, LICSW and PMHC. And she's a licensed clinical social worker, therapist, and a founder of Village Therapy Collective in Mobile, Alabama. Morgan's passionate about all things women's health, trauma recovery, and maternal mental health. As a certified EMDR therapist and a certified perinatal mental health specialist, Morgan brings unique expertise into the treatment of traumas that disproportionately impact women, and she is committed to helping women build villages of support in any season of their lives. In addition to her clinical practice, Morgan speaks at conferences, trainings for healthcare professionals, women's health panels, and on podcasts. She's an approved CEU provider through the Alabama Board of Social Work Examiners and also offers individual and group consultation to clinicians. Morgan is also the co-host of a free postpartum support group in her community and serves on the board of a local nonprofit organization that ministers to women who have experienced miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant loss. In her spare time, you can find Morgan sipping a cinnamon oat milk latte with her husband, having dance parties with her daughters, or creating content for her professional social media space at Your Hired Village. So excited to have you here, Morgan. Let's go ahead and get started so we can hear what you have to say.
Awesome. Thank you, LB, for the warm introduction. And hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here and so excited that Vital is doing this series in general. It's so needed. I know when I started out doing perinatal work, it was so difficult to find trainings in general, but especially things that were pretty local to the South, especially local to Alabama. I did not know of anything. So I love that you guys are doing this and making it accessible to people wherever they are, which I'm hearing and seeing in the chat that people are from kind of all over, which is so fun. So LB is going to be the one in charge of the slideshow because I can't be trusted with technology. But I'm grateful for her help in that way. So we're going to be chatting about PMADS. PMADS stand for perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, and we will get more into the depths of that. She just did such a great introduction. Y'all don't need to know anything else about me other than the fact that I am a very casual person. I do not take myself very seriously, and so if y'all have any thoughts, questions, whatever, please put it in the chat box. I would love to make even the virtual space a bit more interactive. And yeah, so yeah, she pretty much covered all that. Let's just go on. So today, to give you a little bit of an overview of how we're going to use the next 45-ish minutes. We're going to be defining PMADs. We're going to do an overview of the 6 types of PMADs. Now, this is truly an overview because each of those 6 types could be their own hour or more of a training. But gonna skim the surface of all 6 so that you guys have an idea of what PMADs exist and what are some of the signs and symptoms of those. And then at the very end, I want to equip you guys with something that y'all can put into practice this afternoon if you want to. And that is our EPDS screening tool training. So that's where we're heading. Okay, so starting with the definition of PMADs. So, like I said earlier, PMADs stand for perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. That is a long name, so I will probably exclusively say PMADs from here on out. When we talk about that first word, perinatal, that is a medical term that refers to the time in and around childbirth. Most medical professionals consider this to be the window from conception to 1 year postpartum. I will say that I tend to include a little bit of a longer time frame when I'm thinking about perinatal clients. I include the trying to conceive space, so that's preconception, and then I also include up to 2 years postpartum. My reasoning for that personally is that the World Health Organization includes up to 2 years postpartum, and so I choose to have that broader category. So when we're talking about perinatal women, generally speaking, 1 in 5 perinatal women are going to experience a PMAD. It's also important to know that PMADs are not just a women's issue because 1 in 10 men whose partners give birth will also experience a PMAD. And now, just out the gate, I often will share that stat, and people are like, wait, what? Hold on. I did this, he didn't. But what's important to know is that there are so many factors to contribute to the development of a PMAD. One of those being biology. And yes, a woman who gives birth is going to experience much more biological changes, adjustments, etc. However, we do have a lot of research to show that a partner's body also experiences clinically significant shifts in their hormone levels. This is largely due to sleep deprivation, and there's a reason why it's a torture tactic, y'all. It really impacts a lot of things in our body. And so, the main way that we see this play out in men is that sleep deprivation impacts testosterone levels and cortisol levels, and that places them at an increased risk of experiencing a PMAD. So, colloquially, we say things like postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, and I use those terms too. There's nothing wrong with that. However, medically speaking, the term is perinatal, and perinatal is not just defined to a biological woman's body. Perinatal encompasses really the whole family. The family is perinatal. So, that's something to know. It's also important to me, and I say this at every training that I do. It's important to me to encourage those who work with perinatal folks to keep in mind that families who have experienced loss of any kind are also perinatal. Now, for those of you therapists here, this may not be information to come out the gate with on day one of an intake, because it can be a lot to hear. But the reality is, a body that has experienced loss is also a postpartum body. And so that still fits within our perinatal window, that time in and around childbirth. And it's just really important that providers keep that in mind when we're talking about the framework of PMADs. All right, so this is a cute little graphic that came straight off of Postpartum Support International's website, but I think it does a really good job of breaking down and defining PMADs pretty simply. So, P for perinatal, conception to 1 to 2-ish years postpartum. The M for mood is kind of encompassing of our depressive, bipolar disorders, and our psychosis disorders. And the A for anxiety is pretty self-explanatory, but we include perinatal anxiety, OCD, and PTSD. And then for something to be a disorder, it means that daily functioning is impacted. We'll talk about this a bit in a moment, but there are absolutely normal levels of anxiety, emotionality, adjustment struggle. Like there is so much of this that can be absolutely normal, especially within a major life transition. So for something to be disordered, it means that it's impeding with day-to-day life. It clinically, we tend to look at kind of three areas. We look at the frequency, the duration, and the intensity of symptoms. And just like any other mental health condition, PMADS exists on a spectrum, so that can be mild, moderate, or severe presentations clinically. All right, so LB mentioned this, and it is so important that PMADs are the most common complication of childbirth. I think for a lot of us, when we think about childbirth and complications, we think about, maybe health concerns within mom's body, like preeclampsia or gestational diabetes. We may think of emergent cesareans. We may think of NICU. That's typically what my clients are thinking of when we think about complications. But realistically speaking, because 1 in 5 women and 1 in 10 men will experience a PMAD, that is statistically our most common complication. So, in addition to that, it is one of our least treated complications. So, again, clinically, typically, PMADs are going to be diagnosed between conception and 1 year postpartum. One thing to know is that most clients will reach out for help for a PMAD in the postpartum season, but research shows us that up to 70% of those folks had symptoms in pregnancy. They just did not receive any care for that until postpartum. There's a lot of reasons for that, of course. I mean, anyone who's ever been pregnant knows there's a lot going on, and sometimes things get put on the back burner, and that's just how it goes sometimes. Also, lack of universal screening is a factor there. Lack of adequate prenatal care in general can be a factor. But it is important for anyone here who does work with pregnant folks to consider that most of the time these symptoms are going to show up in pregnancy. So what can we be doing to be mindful of that and not just labeling it colloquially like we do as a postpartum struggle? The second, well, let me back up. The most common time for a PMAD to present is 3 to 6 months postpartum. But again, most of the time there has been at least some sign in pregnancy. The second most common time, though, is during or shortly after weaning from breastfeeding. The relationship between lactation and mental health is really complex. Sometimes social media does not make it seem very complex. Sometimes the lactation space and the pro breastfeeding space can really hit hard on the fact that oxytocin, that's produced while breastfeeding, can be a protective factor against mental health struggles. And that is completely true. It's just that there's another side of the coin, and it is the fact that prolactin, which is the main hormone responsible for producing milk, it's a dopamine inhibitor. So that's a fancy way of saying it makes our brain not produce as much dopamine. Dopamine is one of our happy hormones. So for folks who are maybe already dopamine deficient, like ADHD, they're going to get hit even harder in the postpartum space if they choose to breastfeed. So anyways, I love the topic of hormones, but that is not for today. We can go more into that later. It is possible to experience a PMAD in one perinatal season, but not in another. It's kind of a cliche that no two pregnancies are the same, no two kids are the same, and that is so true, even in the mental health space. So just like any other mental health condition, this can exist on a spectrum, but it is a major public health concern because suicide is a leading cause of maternal deaths in the first year postpartum. And that is important to me. And another stat that I give at every single training that I do, because when we think about maternal mortality, we tend to think about things like preeclampsia. We tend to think about things like hypertension. And of course, these things are very important. However, they are not statistically the most likely cause of maternal mortality. Then, when we add in layers of systemic issues that contribute to, racial disparities in maternal mortality, the fact that our maternal mortality is much higher than any other developed nation, these things are so important to consider as a whole picture here. And if we're looking at the whole picture, we cannot exclude mental health from that. Okay, so a lot of people that I have worked with have sent me inquiry on my website or something like that, and they're like, I'm 6 months postpartum and I just can't shake the baby blues. And unfortunately, I have to be the one to tell them that this is not the baby blues. So I wanted to take a moment to define what the baby blues are. A lot of people have heard of that. So what is it? Um, the baby blues is not a medical term, but it is kind of colloquially what we use to define the period of time immediately after childbirth where the hormones are going crazy. The initial recovery is just really intense. We're adjusting, it's kind of the most acute adjustment space. So the baby blues are absolutely real and they have a lot of vulnerability attached to it, a lot of emotionality. The mood is very labile. This is super, super normal. It has a lot to do with what the body just did and what it's trying to adjust to and recover from. It's one of those things where, regardless of how long a body is pregnant, it has had hormones climb, 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 climb for that amount of time. And right after a birth, including a loss, those hormones plummet and they plummet very quickly. So, whether those hormones took 6 weeks to rise or 36 weeks to rise, it still has reached an all-time high, especially if this is a first pregnancy. And so it plummets really hard and it plummets and it gets back to baseline in about 2 weeks. So that is much quicker than it rose. It rose gradually, but it plummets really hard. So when we're talking about the baby blues, typically for most people, these last anywhere from like 3 to 14 days, but there is a peak, and that peak is typically around, I put 3 to 7 days postpartum, but it's usually 5 to 7 days postpartum, usually right around that 1 week mark. Unfortunately, this is also when people, especially on that lower end, like day 5 to 7, it's typically when people are getting home, they're trying to adjust and figure things out by themselves. They are trying to they might be holding off on visitors so that they can kind of get adjusted first, so they may not have as much help around. They lost the ability to lean into those amazing nurses at the hospital. It's just kind of no man's land, honestly. It's really rough. So any mental health symptoms, like episodes of crying, anxiety, feeling heightened, feeling maybe even some intrusive thoughts, all of that within those first couple of weeks are very, very normal, has a lot to do with what the body is going through with that baby blues roller coaster. But any mental health symptoms after that, like 2 to 3-ish week mark, that's not the baby blues. What essentially happens is those hormones climb, 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 and they plummet. And for the breastfeeding mother, they kind of plateau a little bit above baseline hormone levels. And then that weaning causes the last little dip. But for someone who is not breastfeeding after about 4 to 5 days postpartum, they go ahead and plummet all the way back down to pre-pregnancy levels. So any clients with mental health symptoms after that 2 to 3 week mark, they should be screened. We should be taking that very seriously as far as like potential PMAD symptoms, not just the baby blues. All right, so I included another cute little graphic from PSI because they have some good ones. So this is kind of a repeat of what we were saying earlier. Those are, some of the same symptoms that we're seeing. The roller coaster experience. Some folks may try to mitigate this. Those who have either had, consultation with me or another training with me, I do teach a form of self-care called houseplant mode. I did not include that for the sake of time today because we got 6 PMADs to roll through. But if anybody wants to learn about it, feel free to shoot me an email. I would love to teach you about it. It's just a self-care strategy. Okay, so we will start off our overview of the types of PMADs, and it might feel like I'm throwing a lot at y'all, to be honest, but we are gonna, if there are any questions related to these, absolutely feel free to pop them into the chat, and if I don't see them, then LB will stop me, and we will answer those in real time. So, perinatal depression. most commonly referred to as postpartum depression by your clients or PPD. With perinatal depression, we're going to see some pretty classic depressive symptoms. We're going to struggle with sleep and fatigue. We might notice decreased interest and pleasure, both in the things that we typically enjoy, but also in learning new things within parenting. There also may be some feelings of really intense anger that come out. The internet has kind of coined this as mom rage, and it's really kind of gaining traction. You start to see nowadays some clinical trainings based around mom rage. I love that we're talking about this more because there have been so many women for years who have carried such shame over the intensity and the anger that they may feel and not being able to really pinpoint why. But this is actually a really common way that depression can show up. This is also a really common way that perinatal depression in men shows up. And that can be a really confusing thing. Of course, we would want to assess that further and, make sure that we're assessing for any safety needs within the home. But it's important for providers to know that intense anger and feeling like things go from 0 to 100 very fast can sometimes be a sign of perinatal depression. Most of the time, perinatal depression is also going to carry with it some feelings of guilt or shame or feeling like a failure within motherhood. This is such a common manifestation. I wish it weren't because it's heartbreaking to sit in front of a mom that you see is doing such a great job, but for her, she feels like her baby deserves better. She feels like she's just not the mom that this baby deserves. We may also see changes in appetite. I notice anecdotally that this tends to look like lack of appetite in the postpartum season, which is not helpful to our recovery at all. So when we're taking a holistic picture, we definitely want to be assessing for appetite. Are they getting enough nutrients? Are they helping replenish some of the nutrients that they've lost? And then, of course, in severe circumstances, perinatal depression can lead to thoughts of harming oneself or the baby. It is very unlikely that this symptom shows up at all, but when it does, it is most often pretty passive. And what I mean by that is like passive suicidal ideation is like if something were to happen to me, whatever. Or if someone's driving, I drive by this tree every single day, and sometimes I wonder what it would be like if I hit it. It's not necessarily an active ideation most of the time, but it is definitely a red flag that something could become active if not intervened on. And then, of course, if there is ever a circumstance where there is active suicidal ideation, or active thoughts of harm to the baby, that is a psychiatric emergency that we want to take very seriously. All right, so from there, we'll touch on perinatal anxiety.
And then,
Um,
Morgan, before this gets lost, somebody asked, please share houseplant mo mode. So I don't know if there's a way we can talk about it later, like at some point further, or we can include it in slides, or I don't know how you want to do that. But somebody is very interested to know more about that, what you talked about.
I'll give a Spark Notes version, and yes, please email me if you want to know more. So a Spark Notes version is that I completely made this up a few years ago, but basically, when I'm working with someone who's pregnant and I give some education about the baby blues and what is about to happen in the postpartum hormonal roller coaster, and how awful it is. I teach them about houseplant mode, and houseplant mode is essentially a way to get back to the basics of our foundational self-care, in order to kind of rebuild the foundation that we need. And so anything that a thriving, beautiful houseplant needs, you also need. And so don't overthink that. Anything that's popping into your mind right now is accurate. So most of my clients the first thing that they mention is water. So yes, how many of us are walking around dehydrated all of the time? I know I am because I drink more coffee than water. But so start there, not necessarily a magical amount of ounces, but let's bring some mindful attention to water intake. Houseplants need sunlight. We got to see the outside. So, while this training is not about this, this is something that is very important, especially for extended hospitalizations. So, if a mom has to be in a high risk unit for longer than a typical just birth and recovery, and we move on, or if baby's in NICU, those are circumstances where people are kind of tempted to just stay in the hospital all of the time. And no one's psyche is meant to do that. So we got to see the sun. It's also tempting postpartum, even if everything's going well, to just kind of hole up in your bubble. We got to see the sun. Thriving houseplants need nutrients. So how are we kind of replenishing ourselves? Have we touched a protein this week? We need one of those. It's not necessarily about like, here is a diet to prevent postpartum depression. It's more of how can I support my body? I've just been through a lot's been depleted. How do I introduce a little bit back? Anyways, so those are my big three. I have a few others that thriving houseplants needs too, but for the sake of time, I'll start with those. And then if anybody wants to know a little bit more, I keep telling myself I'm going to make a graphic about houseplant mode. So maybe this will be the push I needed to do that.
That's so amazing. That's so like so spot on. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And we also have another, I'm going to read this comment in question, but if you want to save, I don't know if you're going to touch on it later, just let me know. We can come back to it. Someone said, also you mentioned psychiatric risk for suicidal ideation thoughts. What does that entail? Hospitalization. A lot of moms might not reach out due to fear of their children being taken away. What are your recommendations?
Yeah, that's a real fear. And I think that's valid, honestly. I think that we can start with validation. I think that we can start with normalizing that concern. And honestly, the reframe here is like, what a good parent you are that you're already thinking about ways to stay connected, bonded, etc. with your child. And so in order to do that, we need a healthy mom. And so, it is exceptionally rare that a PMAD gets to the point of psychiatric emergency. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we touch on perinatal psychosis, but it's exceptionally rare that it gets to that point. Unfortunately, if it does get to that point, there is typically a separation because mom needs to be treated. Nothing else can happen until we have a healthy mom. And so, unfortunately, in circumstances where that has to happen, like that is very traumatic to have to be separated from your baby so that you get the care you need. And so a lot of times that looks like trauma work after we're stabilized. A lot of times we are then doing some trauma work after that because that's devastating. No one ever wants an experience like that. Um, I when I give some training on the screening tool, it does assess for suicidal ideation. And then as we are getting a little bit more information, if they have any indication that there's even mild thoughts, we want to assess for more detail. When we're getting more detail, we're I think there's a way of letting someone know, like, hey, this is not about whether or not you are a good mom. Good moms have really, really freaking scary thoughts sometimes. And so that's okay. And that has nothing to do with how fit you are as a mother. What it does mean is that we need some treatment. And the good thing about all of this, including even severe cases of perinatal mood disorders, we know what to do with those. We know exactly how to treat them. Everything that we're talking about today is so treatable. And it's treatable with multiple options. So it's not even like you have to go this one path to find healing. So that's kind of the reframe of it. But I think it starts with validation and compassion that is a very valid fear to have. I hope that is a helpful answer.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So perinatal anxiety, most people refer to it as PPA or postpartum anxiety. This is actually our most common PMAD. Most people think that perinatal depression is the most common, but that's not the case as of about 2020. And I'm sure you can understand why. There was a lot happening in 2020 and in 2021. I am a pandemic mom myself, and that was the first time that our research showed more occurrences of perinatal anxiety than perinatal depression. And that has so far continued to be the trend. So Perinatal anxiety is going to look kind of similar to generalized anxiety symptoms. We may struggle with sleep and fatigue, but a lot of times, whereas depression kind of lends towards that hypersomnia for some, perinatal anxiety is often keeping us up because the brain won't shut off, the body won't shut off. And so it's typically due to a lack of sleep that we're feeling some of that fatigue. We're going to have excessive worry that just feels like it's not shutting off, it's ruminating, or I use the term hamster wheeling a lot. Um, we may have feelings of panic or panic attacks. We may also have some intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts are really common in the perinatal window. Research tells us about 85% of parents have them, and that includes male parents. They're very common. Some of our most kind of cliche ones are like, what if I drop the baby down the stairs? Or what if we get in a wreck? Or what if they stop breathing? And so these are, of course, very, very normal fears to have. And I like to educate my clients on why they're happening, which it essentially has to do with the overactivation of the amygdala. The amygdala is the alarm system of the brain, and it is designed to detect any risk to our safety. And when we are pregnant and have a baby, that amygdala kind of extends over our child as well because they don't really have a working amygdala for their own. And so, so our bodies are designed to kind of become overactive on purpose in order to mitigate some of the risks that could come to babies. It's just that, the human body hasn't changed super drastically over the last, thousands of years. But our society has. And so a lot of the struggles of yesteryear, we don't have as much risk of today. Um, but unfortunately, we are still living in bodies that were designed to detect that risk and make sure that we're taking proactive steps against it. So, sometimes that means we're a little overactive for the times. Um, Obviously, while that is a very, in my opinion, a good design of the body, sometimes it does get out of whack, and sometimes the reaction or the response from the amygdala is way too big for the level of risk that we have in real life. So that would be where things start to get disordered. So we may have some excess energy. We might feel like it's just really hard to relax or sit still. This typically manifests like the type of person who needs to clean to calm down. Maybe some of those are in the house today. That is typically anxiety, y'all. This also could manifest as somatic symptoms like stomach aches, tension headaches, dizziness and hot flashes, especially with panic attacks, even sometimes numbness. All right. Perinatal OCD is one of my favorite topics, actually, because a lot of folks are getting labeled with perinatal anxiety that actually have perinatal OCD. And I think that as providers become more competent in perinatal OCD, I think we're going to see those rates rise because people are getting more accurately diagnosed. So obsessive compulsive disorder is, it absolutely has an anxiety component to it. So a lot of those symptoms may look like perinatal anxiety, but perinatal OCD is always going to have a behavioral component in addition to the intrusive thought and anxiety component. So that behavioral component or the compulsion is the thing that acts like a band-aid on the anxiety for at least a little while. So that essentially means that people get stuck in a loop. So they have an intrusive thought of something bad happening to them, to the baby. For a lot of folks, especially neurodivergent folks, intrusive thoughts are less of what if statements and they can be more like a flash of like an image. So maybe instead of the thought of what if I drop the baby down the stairs, it might be a flash of an image of that baby actually falling down the stairs. So that can be another way that intrusive thoughts show up. And so when that happens, the body is like, whoa, 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 I cannot handle this feeling of overwhelm. I've got to relieve it right now. And so then we develop a compulsion or behavior that provides a temporary relief from the intensity of that thought. A lot of times this looks like repeating things, checking things, counting, having a very rigid routine or schedule. Sometimes this can look like things that feel kind of like magical thinking. So like if If I touch this doorknob 3 times, no one will break into my house. But regardless of what that looks like for each person, there's a behavioral component. And then when that behavior kind of soothes the anxiety for a little bit, it unfortunately is always temporary because something else is going to trigger that fear or that intrusive thought again. And then we have a hypervigilance about it coming back. So then when it does, the body feels that intensity even just a little bit more. It's like it turns up a notch. So then we have to do the behavior again. And then that is the OCD loop. And it's really, really awful, honestly. Like moderate to severe OCD is really, really difficult to live with. And it can be really frustrating for folks who are labeled as perinatal anxiety, but they may need an additional kind of support with the behavioral compulsions, or maybe their friends who also have experienced some perinatal anxiety just like can't relate to some of the ways that they're coping. So it can really bring a lot of confusion. It can make moms feel like they are going crazy. I've even had folks that I have diagnosed with perinatal OCD who are fearful that they're becoming psychotic. But the most important thing to recognize with perinatal OCD is that these intrusive thoughts that come, they are clinically called ego dystonic. Ego means self, dystonic means doesn't match. So ego dystonic means the thought does not match how myself actually believes or what I value. Whereas psychosis, on the other hand, we'll chat about in a minute, is ego syntonic. And so that's the key part here is like, folks with OCD need to know that they are not crazy. Just because they are having these thoughts does not make them a bad parent. Thoughts are not the same as actions. That's such an important thing to drive home for folks with OCD. Um,
I have
okay.
two questions.
Yeah.
Are PMADs more common in younger moms than older moms? Is the first.
I don't know of any research proving that. I think, there's so many factors that go into it that, being a younger mom, like particularly like a teenage mom, there are going to be, no doubt, some stressors that are unique compared to other seasons of life. Um, but I also think with age comes some other stressors. And so I think just the multifactorial nature of it, I don't know of any research that tells us that there's an age range that's more common.
That's great. And thank you for that. And then, so someone else said, wait, so more intensive, intrusive thoughts may be common for persons with dyslexia, ADHD, or other types of that neurodivergence that promotes visual or image-driven thinking.
I don't know that we can say with certainty that it's always more intense, but yes, visual is more common for neurodivergent folks. So that's just something to know, like especially if people don't have language, they don't know what an intrusive thought is, but they're saying like, I feel like I'm having these flashes of bad things happening, or even me doing a bad thing to someone else. That is a very common way that intrusive thoughts can show up for a lot of folks. For some, particularly, I would say some of those things like ADHD, where the person probably is a little bit of a deeper feeler because of some of that nervous system dysregulation. Yeah, it might make it more intensive, but I don't know that everyone would say that. For some people, they're just used to having very visual brains, and so they're just kind of like, yeah, it's just normal. I just have these.
Hmm,
So it depends on the person.
gotcha. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, good questions, guys. Okay, perinatal PTSD is probably my favorite topic in the world, but I will be fast. In the DSM, we have 4 categories of symptoms for clinical PTSD. And so those 4 categories within the perinatal period are still the exact same diagnostic criteria. So we're still going to see some struggles with sleep and fatigue, where we might experience some intrusive memories or images from the past event, maybe flashbacks or nightmares. One of the categories as well is avoidance. So These avoidance tendencies could be of reminders of the event. That includes people, places, and things. So something that I always do just routinely is with my perinatal trauma clients is I always check in to make sure that we are attending the follow-up appointments because that those are important, medically speaking, but it can definitely perinatal trauma can be a barrier to attending those appointments. We are going to experience some hypervigilance, maybe an exaggerated startle response, and then really with PTSD, it's so dysregulating to the nervous system that we might experience kind of both sides of the extremes of dysregulation. We might have panic, we may also have detachment and dissociation. Um, yeah, I'll keep it there. All right, perinatal bipolar disorder. A lot of people don't know that bipolar disorder can manifest in the perinatal period for the very first time. Of course, this is quite rare. It is most common in folks who do have a familial history of bipolar disorder. There's just something believed about pregnancy that can kind of like awaken that genetic predisposition. And so with bipolar disorder, even outside of the perinatal space, we have bipolar 1 that has depressive episodes and full mania, and then we have bipolar 2 that has depressive episodes and hypomania. And so both of those can be present in the perinatal season as well. And really, sleep, and especially sleep deprivation, can be one of the biggest risk factors for this. That is because we are not meant to not sleep for very long. It is a torture tactic for a reason. And so, for folks who have a predisposition, this can kind of almost ignite a manic episode, that sleep deprivation. Another way that this can sometimes show up clinically is if someone gets treated for what they believe to be perinatal depression, and then that antidepressant kind of launches them into mania. That is a common way that people find out that they have bipolar disorder. So it's one of those things where if you're working with someone who does choose that medication as part of their journey for what y'all believed was PPD, and then suddenly the next week we are existing way on the other side of the spectrum there, then that's definitely some red flags for perinatal bipolar disorder, which for some clients, it is possible that they may have had undiagnosed bipolar disorder already, and then we catch it in the perinatal season. So, anything that you know about signs and symptoms for typical bipolar disorder or ways that people may exhibit, especially some of those hypomanic things, those are things to be looking for in the perinatal space too. Not common, but can happen. And then our last PMAD is perinatal psychosis. And this is one that a lot of people don't like to touch on. This is one that, unfortunately, based on media coverage of psychosis, we typically hear the worst of the worst situations. So, one thing that I like to always share about perinatal psychosis is that it is exceptionally rare. Roughly about 1 in 1,000 births will experience some form of perinatal psychosis. Again, that can be in pregnancy or postpartum. So 1 in 1,000, if you are an outpatient clinician, you may not ever see it in your whole life. If you are hospital based, if you are OB care, if you are literally a perinatal therapist only, then you probably will see it at some point. But one of the most important things to know about perinatal psychosis is that the vast majority of circumstances are not dangerous. The stat is that roughly about 5% of perinatal psychosis patients have active SI or HI, so suicidal ideation or homicidal ideation. So 5% out of the 1 in 1,000. I'm not real good at math, y'all, but that's like not a lot of people. Unfortunately, though, of that tiny percentage of people who do experience active suicidal or homicidal ideation, we tend to hear about the circumstances where those are completed. those psychotic thoughts are completed. I really have a bone to pick with the media on that because that is not the way it typically goes. Perinatal psychosis is a psychiatric emergency. It does require hospitalization, but it is so treatable. We can absolutely get through it. Women who have perinatal psychosis can go on to be great moms. I've worked with two moms who have had perinatal psychosis so far, and both of them are wonderful mothers. And both of them went on to experience another pregnancy where they did not have psychosis. They had good providers who were, doing everything in their power to protect against these types of things. But anyways, so with psychosis, we mentioned earlier that intrusive thoughts are ego dystonic. They do not match our values, and what we believe, like our core self. With perinatal psychosis, this is when delusions and intrusive thoughts and grandiosity and hallucinations, they start to become egocentric, which means that they start to feel like they match. So if you're working with clients and they come in and they admit to you that they're having these horrible thoughts and they're so scary and they make them feel like they are the worst mom on earth and that they shouldn't even be allowed to have children and that they're scared that they're psychotic, well, they've already given you enough reason to know that they're not psychotic, because of that ego dystonic nature. If someone is coming in and they're sharing some delusional or strange beliefs or thoughts or urges, and they're really kind of feeling like, yeah, actually, it feels like it's making sense. I feel like I just need to do this. That is our red flag territory because that is starting to feel syntonic. And yeah, that's where we need to act. This can also look like severe paranoia and severe suspiciousness, even to people who are typically safe and supportive people for them. So yeah, that's our overview of psychosis. For the sake of time, I'm going to breeze through the end and then answer any more questions at the tail end. Wanted to touch a bit on substance use in the perinatal period because this is commonly co-occurring with PMADs. So at least right now, we don't classify substance use disorders in the perinatal period as a type of PMAD, but sometimes the relationship can be kind of bidirectional, like the substance use can contribute to the PMAD symptoms and the PMAD symptoms can sometimes contribute to the substance use. So, but when we talk about SUD, again, it's just important to remember that maternal suicide and maternal overdose are some of the leading causes of maternal mortality. So, it's my recommendation for folks to universally screen for both PMADs and SUDs. I will admit I'm not a substance use specialist, so when my clients have kind of a top clinical priority need is to address the SUD. I do typically refer out to some great local partners, but when I'm assessing as someone who does not specialize in this area, I use the 4 Ps, which are essentially assessing for like, any of your parents have a substance use disorder? Does your partner have any problems with substances? And have you in the past or the present had any struggles with substances? Those are sort of my go-to assessing questions. So it is important for us to just remind our clients that substance use as a potential coping strategy, this is not a moral failing. Sometimes this is a way of dealing with perinatal trauma, dealing with intimate partner violence, dealing with factors that are just beyond their control. They may need to numb that out. Anyways, so we want to be mindful of the fact that like all behavior is communication. What is the SUD communicating? And I like to just always remind folks of the fact that behind every statistic is a human and a story. I think it's important in healthcare for us to remember that what our normal Wednesday consists of is someone else's worst case scenario, and they're navigating a season that they never pictured looking the way that it does. So at the tail end of this presentation that I may not have time for is the EPDS screening tool. So the EPDS is the Edinburgh. This is kind of our valid, reliable screening tool for perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. It does not take any level of licensure, any specific degree. or whatnot to do this screening tool. Literally anyone can do it. That's because it's not diagnostic, it is just screening. So it kind of takes the guesswork out of when to refer a client to a perinatal specialist. So it's very simple. The client fills out, it's 10 questions, and you score it. To me, the math is the hardest part. I'm not gonna lie to you, but it's not too bad. It only goes to a maximum of 30. But anything above a 10 is kind of our threshold for like, okay, we need to go ahead and refer. So in addition to that, question number 10 assesses for suicidality. So if there is any answer that is not a check mark on never, then we need to assess that further, make sure we're doing a safety plan until they can get to that perinatal specialist. It is a very easy tool to use. If you use certain EHRs like Simple Practice and things like that. They have the EPDS internally in it. There's also, I think, some websites where your clients can kind of click through it and it'll do the math for you. We love that. But even if you have to do good old pen and paper, it is not difficult. Anyone can be trained on how to do this in any setting. And it just really helps take the guesswork out of like, okay, should I have this conversation about the signs and symptoms I'm seeing or not? Anything below a 10 is considered typical life stress from this big life adjustment. Um, so yeah. So that is the tail end. If anyone on here does have an organization who would like to be trained in the EPDS in a more thorough manner, I do offer that. But again, it is not difficult. All right, I did include in here as well a couple of resources, just a couple of important phone lines that you can save and give to your clients if needed. Also, Postpartum Support International offers so many great support groups, dozens of free support groups that meet virtually. They also have a directory to perinatal specialists so that you can look and see, okay, who are the perinatal specialists in my area? Who are the ones that have the trainings or the credentials that meet minimum requirements to be on this directory. That's always a great resource to keep. And so yeah, with our last couple minutes, I'd love to answer any questions if we can.
Awesome. Love it. This is so good. We do have a question. What is beneficial to screen for PMADs when I'm a SUD therapist that specifically see pregnant and postpartum women in my facility?
So the benefit would be that, even substance use is going to kind of place someone in an added risk factor for experiencing a PMAD, but it is just one risk factor. So it's not necessarily guaranteeing that someone will. However, we can go ahead and in pregnancy while they're in treatment, be doing psychoeducation around what some of the signs and symptoms are, being proactive about what are some of the supports that we may want to put in place. And if there are any pre-existing conditions, especially in the realm of like bipolar disorder or any any serious forms of like severe mental illness, then we want to be preparing for what the postpartum season is going to look like. What supports can we put in place? How can we support mom and baby the best? Build healthy families, build healthy communities.
Absolutely. And then somebody was asking about suggestions to where to gain more training to become a PMHC. And I dropped the postpartum.net website there. And on one of the drop down tools will be for professionals. And that's where you can go to learn more about the certification and like the requirements within that. And Morgan, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, the PMHC credential is specifically through Postpartum Support International. There are other great training institutions, some of which their trainings can kind of count as PSI's, I guess, requirements towards training. So it's worth looking into. I really love PSI. I think they're a great organization doing really great things globally. Another organization that I am a part of in the sense that like I have been mentored by its founder for 4 years now is called the Touchstone Institute. If anyone here is a trauma provider, a trauma specialist, that is a great option for looking into some trauma focused perinatal training.